You're listening to the Live Life Longer show with Dan Voss, inspiring you to live longer through the cold, the hot, breathing, eating, and being nature. In this week's episode, my guest is Dr. Melanie Keller. As a naturopathic doctor, Dr. Melanie helps people understand their lives and bodies better so that they can receive the precise care that they need. After having gut health problems over half her life, Dr. Melanie uses her expertise on gut health and epigenetic intuition to get results. Dr. Melanie, welcome to the Live Life Longer show.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I have enjoyed some of the conversations that we've had over the last few weeks. I'm happy we've been introduced. I know a lot of what your work circles around. It aligns really nicely with what I enjoy in talking about. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about your story and how you came about wanting to be a naturopathic doctor.
Okay, well, let's see. I grew up where my family, we were transferred quite often. My dad worked for the government. So up to the age of 6, I'd been transferred to multiple states. And the last place that he was transferred to was Washington, D.C. And my mother had a friend who was in rural Alaska, like a 3rd grade friend. And so when they divorced, she went to visit them. And I went from the world of what I call like the lower 48, which is how Alaskans will explain it, to a world of rural Alaska with no stoplights, no Kmarts or slushies or, this whole other world, which was amazing. And grew up in a pristine lifestyle in a commercial fishing family and co-op, like grocery and all these things that were very unique to rural Alaskan life. And yet I struggled with some things in my health, and my parents were very healthy, and I just was able to reflect on some things about how now I'm an epigenetic intuitive, about how maybe you can do all of the right things, but it may not always equal results. So you have to know more specific things about yourself to achieve those results.
It's so interesting. Yeah, I mean, just living in a place like Alaska is so unique. What were some of the things that you enjoyed most about being in that setting, in that environment, that maybe we don't get in the lower 48, as you alluded to?
Yeah, let's see. A lot of, just the scenery is stunning. I think I didn't really realize that. Oh, actually, there's a story where as a child, again, let's say going to Kmart, that's what's coming to mind, and you would get your picture taken, and there was like this little thing that they drew down of like nature in the background, and you got your picture taken in front of the mountains or the trees, right? This is the 70s or early 80s. And so I was like, hey mom, that looks like, like the screen that you pull down to get your picture taken in front. She's like, no honey, that's real. And that I just remember that being so profound, even at such a young age. And then the winter came, because we arrived in October. And by the winter, we were cross-country skiing. And then we stop at this watering hole, or they call it the spring. And it's this like glacier, off the mountain. And there's a spout where people will pull up, drive up, fill up their gallon tank, and off you went. And then sometimes people would line up and you'd chit-chat, So that was just an interesting thing of like, this is where we get our water. And it was very special water. That was the spring water that you used for certain things.
Sure. How would you say that setting, growing up in Alaska and being in such a beautiful landscape in nature, how has that kind of shaped some of the work you're doing now as a naturopathic doctor around being in nature? And I know you and I have talked before about grounding, even things like meditation. How have you taken some of the things that you grew up around and incorporated that into your practice now?
Well, a great example that's coming to mind is we always had a Tide book on the table, on the coffee table. There was always a Tide book everywhere. So I'm very aware of how the moon affects us. And so what I'll often talk to people about is their cycle. And women will often assume that I'm referring to their menstrual cycle or when they bleed, which, yes, that can be a part of it, but everyone has a cycle. And if they really can tune in, or at least I can almost see their Tide book, if that makes sense, where I can say, oh, okay, that's interesting that we're going through this during this phase of the moon. And I'd say that's not always like in my mind, but I just find it interesting that people do have cycles and patterns about themselves. And when you can work with those and you can meet somebody where they are, instead of saying, oh no, you should be in this cycle and pattern, which doesn't align with them. That's one of the reasons we use seed cycling, actually, to help align a woman's cycle. So there's certain seeds taken at certain times to make this shift and adjustment. But we meet them where they are and give them the certain seeds at the certain place that they are to then create that shift.
That's super interesting. And a lot of that probably ties into your work around epigenetics. Can you explain to us what epigenetics is and how that applies to the work you're doing with your patients?
Yeah, so even the CDC has a definition for epigenetics where we're talking about the environment and our behaviors can affect the way our genes work. So we're not necessarily talking about changing the gene itself. We're talking about what is going to turn on or turn off that gene to then express itself in perhaps a negative direction or to be damaged in some way. So there are so many researchers, and I always go with evidence-based, and I'm thinking of someone in particular that can show me I might have specific genetic SNPs, is what we call them, where I'm a mutant at a particular multiple SNPs. But by knowing that about myself, I was able to go and look at what are the things that, let's say, for example, put on the accelerator to this enzyme and what can put on the brakes. And that is also only at that enzyme, let's say. So I call it, we have to zoom in to the microscopic level or the cellular level, the mitochondria, zoom, zoom, zoom. And then we have to zoom out and we have to say, okay, where does this person live? What is their attitude? What are they thinking? What's their, their belief system? What are all the things that are also influencing? So yes, science may say fish oil does blank, but it can also do some negative things if it's too much or for too long, or the FODMAP diet, another example where it's like, oh, just do the FODMAP diet. Well, that should be really done a certain way under a certain supervision, and it should be introduced in certain ways. So that meet where the person is, right? So This is what epigenetics is all about. It's like meeting where you are and taking things into account. I just spoke with somebody recently and they're even in the hospital system, and we're discussing how they had a female fibroid, which I know is oftentimes an estrogen dominance. So just even in bringing up the fact that the environment could have an influence here, they then blurted out, oh, you mean the bubble that was in my bathroom of water that was coming through and they just kind of slapped and fixed it up. So just that aha moment for that person, even if it's just a consult, for them to say, oh my goodness, wow, that's unique to me. That's unique to my story and my situation. And now they can seek out the person, hopefully, that can put their puzzle together for health.
That's interesting. What about our environment can we be paying attention to? Is it as simple as just paying attention to some of those signs or red flags? How can we become more aware of our environment, whether it's good or bad, so that we can make those necessary changes?
Yeah, so we can think of something even simple as far as I just purchased a water bottle, and it came with this sleeve, right, to protect it, and it's this neoprene sleeve or what have you, and here's this beautiful glass and stainless steel, all these perfect things, but the neoprene covering just smelled like it was off-gassing, right? And so as much as I wanted to keep it, I was like, oh, that's great. I had to say, nope, let's remove this, let's take it outside, because even if I'm just sitting there and I can smell it, or doing, just cleaning, my goodness, we had a recent situation where everybody started cleaning everything, and it's like, well, how much are those cleaners perhaps off-gassing things that we might need to then be just making sure that we're removing it from our system? So there are ways for us to detox, right? They're just in terms of living on planet Earth these days, right? We are breathing in and taking air is a big one, because we are filtering a lot of air. So, for example, I think plants can help. Plants are the most, even if you don't have a green thumb, you can find plants that will survive for you. I've done it myself. And then a simple air filtration, I think, is where people can look. And if they have the option of, say, looking at any furniture, any bedding, anything that's coming in, if you can always select something that has the right fibers, whether it's bamboo or even having some charcoal or organic things that are going to be on your skin and where you spend a lot of time. So investing in a good mattress, investing in good bedding. So it depends on where somebody is. You know, sometimes we're in a position where we do have to go with a more cost-effective brand or something or other, but at the same time, what are things that we can do to help, like say if it's off-gassing, can we then set it outside and make sure that it has proper time to release those gases before bringing it into our home? That's just urban living, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing how many things that we have in our environment that we might not be aware of in terms of what might be toxic, or just certain upgrades that we can make to our environment, into our home. I'm a big fan of house plants. I have a few now that I have proudly taken care of and kept alive for at least 6 months. So yeah, I'm getting into that indoor house plant idea. It's definitely there's a lot of benefits to it, you know, in terms of cleaner air and just more of mental health benefits as well, of reducing anxiety and stress and things like that. So that's cool. I would like to learn a little bit more, or a lot more about gut health. I know much of what you work on is around gut health. So tell us a little bit more about why the health of our gut is so important to our overall health.
Well, I believe it was Hippocrates who said all disease begins in the gut, and and it is the center of our body. The small intestine is pretty much right behind your umbilical, your belly button, right? So that's our solar plexus. And the reason why it's so essential, especially in the small intestine, is that this is where all of the digestion of our nutrients takes place. A lot of times people will refer to it as our stomach. And yes, there is some breakdown that happens in the stomach, and that's a pH-based thing, that then the pH shifts into the small intestine, and that's where a majority of this absorption is happening. And we'll hear this term leaky gut, which technically is intestinal permeability. So I just like to remind people, whether it's environmental toxins or whatever, if it's corn, if it's gluten, if it's soy, whatever the culprit is, if it's kind of causing that irritation and causing like this rash that then continues to rub up against, yes, you're going to get this wear and tear into the membrane, let's say. But simply removing it doesn't always like alleviate or solve everything, right? So let's say somebody has this gluten-free, soy-free, all the free diet, yet they live in a toxic home, right? Those toxins are going to still disrupt the microbiome also, because there are studies that show, just for example, glyphosate, or Roundup as its brand name. There are clear studies that show that this chemical itself can slow down the motility of the small intestine. So that is really important to say, okay, well, I can be right following this, like I say, whatever free, eliminate all of these things that, yes, evidence shows that this is inflammatory, et cetera, et cetera. But I also still say why. Because humans existed at a time when they used wheat. Humans existed at a time when they ate, right, these foods and soy and rice and, I mean, for centuries, So I'm just kind of like, what's the difference here, folks? Is it really the actual food, or is it how it's being created? Is it actually the animal fat, or is it the fact that fat is, inundated with chemicals as well? So these are all factors that go into what we're talking about in the small intestine, right? So as we're absorbing things, we have to consider the absorption, and like I just mentioned, even if it's grass-fed and lovely, there's still that fat that is accumulating these toxins. And if we even think about the organic, which of course I'm a proponent of, but that also then takes out fungicides, that makes that ingredient more susceptible. So then again, we want to be mindful of that. We want to say, okay, yes, these are organic greens, and I'm going to take extra precaution in cleaning them properly, right? So that the small intestine has the cleanest, greenest, well-chewed, well broken down from the stomach into the small intestine, where all the magic happens, all of the absorption, a lot of our neurotransmitters or the brain chemicals that we're seeing a predominance of anxiety, depression, lack of motivation, dopamine dominance, just even from social media, right? We get those clicks and you're just like, ooh, having fun with likes, etc. Those are all things that can either be external influences that are then affecting our gut, and then our gut has internal influences that then affect our behavior. So if we are eating a dirty and living in the city and not ever having, right, this grounding or earthing, or maybe even not even getting outside into the actual sunlight for a significant amount of time, that's just going to really clog up the drain, right, and cause static. And for some people that may then equal constipation literally, or it may actually have this diarrheal effect. And what is a little bit unfortunate is that a lot of options are over the counter, right? There's a lot of Band-Aids that people can go to so that they think that that might just be normal. Oh, I've had diarrhea my whole life. Oh, that's just how I roll. Oh, that's my upset stomach. And instead, we really could look at that and say, well, actually, let's maybe look at that a little further. Yeah.
So it sounds like much of, or maybe all, like you said, Hippocrates said, all disease begins in the gut. Is that what we need to be looking at then when you say we might have a certain condition or a disease? It needs to start at looking at the health of our gut. Is that correct?
Yes, but when I'm saying that, I don't just mean let's zoom in and look at a stool test and a this, and let's give this and that, and antibiotics and probiotics, and I'm working on my gut health. Or yes, there are practitioners who say, oh, you have to start with the gut. But what does that mean? Are you talking to them about food hygiene? Are you talking to them about how they think about their food as they're putting it into their body? Do you talk to them about setting the fork down and having gratitude? And, that is also gut health. Does that make sense? Like, it's not, oh, there's a parasite, there's a this, there's a that, and let's go attack it and kill it. Because that can only last so long if we don't look at the environment. Because that thing or that parasite or that what have you will come right back. If somebody, for example, loves their sashimi, they love that tuna.
Yep.
So I'm always going to think of parasites in that case.
Yeah. Why are some of those things so important? When you mention, being more mindful when we eat, maybe a gratitude practice, maybe just being around other people for our meals, right? Like being with family and not on your phone. Why are all of those things so important for our health and our gut health?
Well, there are clear studies about this, actually. I read a lot about the stomach, and they've done studies about saying gratitude, and I've actually witnessed it. There is a particular test called the Heidelberg pH test, and a colleague of mine was the patient, and we were describing it. We're getting training on the system. So their stomach acid, it wasn't reacidifying. So we were watching that, and they're furiously taking notes, and they were really intellectual about it, right? And I couldn't help but just say, hang on a second, put the pen down, take a deep breath. And it was so fascinating to just see that the stomach, from it not wanting to reacidify to just it just took a plunge. Even, in fact, all of us, we were kind of like, whoa, to just watch that. And then to watch that person choose to be mindful and be thinking about what they wanted to eat, because we were in this, this university setting. And then we had them go back to writing and taking notes and thinking, etc. And it was just absolutely fascinating to watch the stomach's response. So that's one of those things where, as peaceful as we can be and not multitasking. Now, I know we have life and people might be driving and this and thatting, but as best we can, because it really doesn't take that long, right? To have a mindful moment with your protein bar, to really, even sometimes I'll kind of I'll close my eyes and I'll put the phone on airplane mode and say, I'm eating lunch right now.
Yep.
There is absolutely nothing else to do. Because when we look at animals, I love this example my mentor gave me. If you have this moose chomping on pussy willows, like just eating away and doesn't think anything of it, but a bear comes along and they smell that bear, they immediately stop. They go from that parasympathetic, chilling, eating, to, what's going on?
Yep.
And they look for their baby, and that is where, if we're constantly in that sympathetic dominance, if we're constantly going, what's going on? What's on Facebook? What's this? What's that? I got to check my email. While you're eating, I got to watch this show. Do you really?
Wow.
Because then I might look at what's the multitasking going on in somebody's life that they need to be doing. And it can be really fascinating if it's just like, yep, you know what? Because it happens to me. I have to have my multitasking moment. And you will notice that you don't taste as much. You don't have as much. You might not digest it as well. You might kind of feel a little indigestion. Yep. Whereas when you have that moment, when you just close your eyes and savor the foodie flavors and, just go, wow, and be grateful and think of where that food even came from. It's pretty profound, the response your body will have. It will be grateful back to you for doing so.
So what's happening there? Is it mostly centered around stress when we take time to be grateful, or take deep breaths before we eat, or just be mindful while we're chewing? Are we actually kind of reducing that stress? And then if so, what role does stress play in the health of our gut and just our overall health?
Well, that's one of the things that I think is interesting in medicine, is there's this proverbial capital letters, bold, red stress. And everybody wants to know what it does to the body and everybody's body. Like, what's the common denominator? And it's like, well, it's different in every person, number one,
True.
Right? And number two, what we just described, parasympathetic versus sympathetic. And right now we know we live in a world where we are inundated with sympathetic dominance. And that is being in this world with clicks and dings and constant information. And the fact that we can know about what's going on halfway around the world, right? Whereas even 100 years ago, where it was like people were traveling to then come bring the newspaper, to then be like, this is what's going on in Austin, Texas. And people are like, what? Right? Why do we need to have so much energy, so much vibration coming at us? And it really is. We were just talking about this, versus getting centered and saying, okay, body, like we can actually talk to our body. I decide that this time is for eating. I'm going to be centered. I'm going to digest this. I'm going to be appreciative of this. And as we connect into that, our parasympathetic gets activated. That's just human physiology. There's no explanation for that other than that is what is, right?
Yeah.
But if we are inundated with signals and stresses, i.e. television, like these, email, etc., those are all sympathetic stresses onto our system that puts us into sympathetic dominance. Our digestion is going to go, whoop, we need to hang on. There might be a bear. Don't digest. Don't do any motility. We might need to run because my boss just called, or that contract is a great deal, or I got to hire that coach.
Yep.
If you relax, if you get into that meditation, if we listen to our body and say, body, what do you need right now? And sometimes it's saying no to some activities. Sometimes it's saying no to being this perfect being that does all of the perfect things. I call it orthobiohackia.
Yeah, so much of what you're describing is why I love things like spending time in nature and breath work and even cold exposure, in the sense that you are in this state of high stress for just a few minutes. But then when you overcome that first minute or so, then you can just sit in kind of peace and silence. And I know that sounds crazy because it's like, it's an ice bath. Why would that be peaceful? But there's something that just kind of switches, where you just you're able to be in the moment and present and just remove all distractions and chaos and noise and clutter around you. And I noticed the same thing, like I said, being in nature, hiking, earthing. I mentioned breath work, meditation. A lot of people don't realize, we hear the word meditation, I didn't really understand this fully until recently, that meditation is the art of doing nothing. And what a beautiful thing that is in today's world, where we're always doing something. We're always checking our phones. We're always checking emails and scrolling through Instagram. And we're going from meeting to meeting and working on the next project and thinking about what we need to work on next. And what a beautiful gift that we have in meditation, that we can just sit in silence and do nothing. And that to me is what I enjoy the most out of all those things I just mentioned.
I very much appreciate that. And also it can be doing or being in the no-thingness, right? So sometimes I just said about the multitasking, but for some people, some patients, I find that, for example, there's someone who's coming to mind where they're running is their meditation, right? So you're saying it's to do nothing, but it's also that while they're running, they allow themselves to be in a no-thingness place, right? That just empties their mind. So whatever that is for you, or maybe for you it's in nature, right? It can be that it's on a walk. It can be you may be meditating when you do your cold therapy, and that is a perfect example of sympathetic to parasympathetic. Because right, as you're training yourself to increase into cold therapy, because at first you're like, whoa, no, body does not want to do it, because it's so clear that that's a sympathetic response. But as you develop and train that, and I love how you just described that relationship that you can have, that knowingness of saying, okay, I see what my body's doing in this reaction to this extreme cold. Thank you, body. And then thank you for also having this innate response to bringing me peace in regulating things. And when we can see that our own body can do that, that's profound.
Yeah, it's really powerful stuff. Another example I've recently kind of discovered is just spending time with my dog, playing. Like, just she's laying on the floor and she's playing right now. She's going to town on a bone, but after I hang up here, I'll probably just spend a few minutes on the ground with her, just like rolling around and playing with her. And it's just an amazing thing that we can step away from the screens. And like I was saying before, social media and the TV's on, and that digital world that we're constantly consumed by. It's nice to have something like in the real world, the flesh, right? Just playing with a dog, something so simple, but so powerful.
Oh, my dog got me through med school, trust me. And it was exactly what you said. I was like, let's play. Or she knew when I needed to go to bed, she would come and talk to me, like, girl, you need to go to bed. Or she'll bring a toy and be like, you need a break. I'm like, you're right. Jeez. Yeah. And I always felt better. Even if I had to set the alarm for 2 minutes, I only have 2 minutes to play. It was, or, because I was on such a schedule, but it was always the best thing.
Yeah. Pets are remarkable. They're very brilliant. Much of what we've been talking about, is this what the mind-gut connection is? Can you explain a little bit more about that mind-gut connection and what we have been talking? Is that correlated to that?
Absolutely. Because all of these things, there are studies about meditation helping in irritable bowel syndrome. As many of your listeners may know, there's the gut-brain connection, right? So it kind of goes back and forth in terms of if our gut's feeling better, our brain's going to be feeling better. Our brain's feeling better, we're going to have a better outlook on what we're putting into our bodies, et cetera, right? So that's, I think, the biggest thing that people, they just innately even know. Right. I think that there's a reason why there's the common phrase trust your gut, and I have a gut feeling, or when people actually love it, if I see it in shows or what have you, of people, and it's not to say it's funny if somebody is going to have loose bowels, but it'll be interesting to see what their life situation is, right? Something, I've seen it on a reality show or something, and you're just like, oh, that's so fascinating that they're concerned about their diarrhea, or they want to go kind of take something to fix it, right, to patch the hole. But really they need to look at that relationship that they're in, or that how they're being treated, right? So that can be unique to be able to speak to somebody about their health, their mental health connection to the gut. Or like I say, I see a lot of people who have been doing such extensive work and research on their gut health that they're almost overly informed and they lose that ability to tap into their intuition. They kind of are like, oh, but so-and-so said, and this says, and I have to eat this way and that way. But I'm like, I like to train them and say, but what works for you? What's the best thing that's going to work in your life, in your schedule, in your, like what you want to do? Yeah. And just by even, sometimes people are like, they're taken aback by that and wait a minute, lady, and then also they're kind of like, oh my gosh, that's so comforting. And maybe even that's the healing message they needed to hear in that moment of just like, what really even works for you. So I hope that makes sense in answering the question of like. No,
it definitely does. That I think is much of what that holistic health approach is, that individualized approach that, what works for one person might not work for another. And I think that's a big takeaway is to really look at what's going to work for me and my health and my lifestyle and my life. So that definitely helps. Along the lines of obviously you've mentioned small intestine health, and that's a large part of your expertise is SIBO, small intestine bacterial overgrowth. Can you tell us a little bit more about what SIBO is and how it affects our health?
Yes, so SIBO, or small intestine bacterial overgrowth, is what I just said. I like to say it's just stating what it is, because there's a lot of like, oh no, it's this, it's that, it's not a condition, it's not a syndrome, it's not a, it is what we said it is. And the reason why it is that way is because there are a variety of ways that can happen. So I call those risk factors. So that's another individual aspect of like, well, what are your unique risk factors? Mine are different than anybody else's. I'm a unique snowflake of exactly how and what triggered me and to have an effect on this specific cleaning action wave called the migrating motor complex. So as I said earlier, this is where all the magic happens. All the digestion of nutrients and all of our neurotransmitters, 90% of them are being made in the gut. But this wave needs to be moving things along. So the analogy that I like to kind of give is if somebody has what I call a skip in the record, where they're not able to have this wave move properly, then it's like people showing up for the probiotics or these foods, right? Prebiotic foods that we've eaten. They show up to this ballroom and they're at the wrong ballroom. They show up to this wedding and they're in the wrong ballroom. And so they get filled up and filled up and filled up into this space, and they're reaching max capacity, when really all they need to do is get the double doors opened into this other room, which is the large intestine, where they belong. That's where the wedding, that's where the party is. But they're all trapped in this other place because, and it depends on these risk factors for why or how, I call it like, how deep of a skip in the record do they have? Do they have just a little scratch where you might not even hear it in the song? Or do they have a pretty deep groove, which would equal an autoimmune response, that actually makes them have to go up and pick up the needle and move it to continue the song, if that makes sense? Yeah. So that's based on a blood test. So having this information on this blood test on how deep of a skip in the record will tell me how difficult it's going to be to get this overgrowth of bacteria, so small intestine bacterial overgrowth. Now, previously, we were able to measure this with a breath test, because getting into the small intestine to test anything is very, very challenging in science. In fact, people who are using references of stool testing or even urine testing, claiming they're diagnosing the small intestine, is incorrect. Because actually getting to the small intestine, it's a really very scientific process. You cannot expose the specimen to oxygen, okay? So there's only a few people that I even know of that have had what's called an aspirate, the gold standard of getting a duodenal aspirate of the small intestine to then having an official gold standard diagnosis of SIBO. Wow. And because it's so difficult, that's why we have a breath test. And the breath test is we test for H. pylori this way via hydrogen. And now for SIBO, we're specifically measuring for hydrogen is actually just a fuel source. So it's out there, and I'm sure people can Google that hydrogen equals such and such of SIBO, when really new information will be provided to say, well, actually hydrogen is just a fuel source. And we're really working with hydrogen sulfide, which is the other bacteria. Now we also have methane, which Again, many people might lump all of these microbes together because that's how they've been pretty much up until October of 2020. They've been lumped together to say they're all bacterial as SIBO. But technically there's one that's an archaea or an ancient microbe, and we call that methane, or it produces methane. So methane is now separated out, and we actually call it intestinal methane overgrowth. So I just wanted to be really specific and get everybody up to date on that. That yes, we can do this breath test that will show us methane, right? So somebody might say, I've had a SIBO breath test that measures methane. But if they only have methane elevated, they do not have SIBO, they have methane overgrowth. Just to make that clarification, okay?
So the breath test is not actually, sorry to interrupt, the breath test is not actually detecting SIBO in its truest form, it's detecting the methane growth, right?
Well, you can get both diagnoses if you get this new test. October 2020 is when this came onto the market, where it's measuring, it's called the Trio Smart breath test. And that's where it's measuring hydrogen, methane, hydrogen sulfide. So we've been waiting for years to get hydrogen sulfide in a breath. And again, it's because you really need some very technical, I've been reading Dr. Pimentel's patents for years. Like, this is a big, exciting thing.
Yeah.
So many people might have been seeing practitioners who are using any other testing, and that's great. But oftentimes, this is the only company I know of that is also measuring hydrogen sulfide. So technically, bacteria are going to be hydrogen and hydrogen sulfide. So even though that test is measuring methane, that's not SIBO. That's methane overgrowth.
Okay.
Again, I'm just being really technical here with the bacterial piece and the methane piece, because that can really change your treatment. Okay, if you're gastroenterologist, no offense, but some gastroenterologists go, oh, let me just give rifaximin, which is the generic name for this. It's a eubiotic antibiotic, meaning it removes what shouldn't be there, right? These are our friends. They're just in the wrong compartment. They aren't bad guys coming to the party, right? There are probiotics. There's just too many of them. So rifaximin, or Xifaxin is the brand name, that takes away gram-negative bacteria. And so it's getting rid of everybody who's in the wrong place. Sorry, guys. And then this antibiotic actually turns into a probiotic once it goes into the large intestine, where it then replenishes lacto and bifido bacteria. So instead of saying, oh, I've got to be on a probiotic this whole time because I'm on an antibiotic, that's actually not the case. And that's also the reason why that antibiotic has a price tag, or it has historically had a price tag on it, because it is very unique. It is not broad spectrum, taking out everything and then leaving nothing behind. It is taken away, come on everybody, you don't belong here. And here you go, let me replace it so that you guys can balance things out. So I think that's really important, because oftentimes botanical medicine, which of course I'm a huge fan of, but sometimes people can be using that, it's also powerful. So people can be using it too long or forever, or they're using something like oregano, which I have high respect for, that may be even too powerful for that person. So, and not replenishing. So it's a nice dance that you have to do and find. But the main thing I wanted to get across here is how that you get that diagnosis definitely leads to how you treat it.
That makes sense. Okay. That's super helpful. What about probiotics? What should we know about probiotics? Do we need them? Do we not need them? Are they safe to take? What do they do? Tell us a little bit more about probiotics.
Ooh, well, this is where I have a strong opinion, in the sense that I guess my general sense is that I don't believe that we need probiotics. I find that and that's with all due professional courtesy and respect to any and all researchers and those making attempts to do wonderful things. I actually listen to a lot of them and follow a lot of them. However, again, it's the whole zoom in, zoom out. Because when we're looking at the research, or we're looking at what they are a researcher in, for example, mental health or what have you, right? We always have to take in that perspective of saying, oh, wow, how much of this is going to be pertinent in this individual? Whether it's soil-based or spore-based, like all of these things, I just don't see the reproducible evidence of that, other than in it, it's just case and hearsay often, because I've also never really met, and this is again just me personally, someone who has only isolated their treatment to probiotics, right? So that's what makes it difficult even in medicine. That's why there's not often a lot of nutrition studies, because there's so many variables about providing the food, and then how is that person going to manage and eat that food. I feel that there's a similar situation here. People will pop in a probiotic and not tell their doctor, just thinking, oh, but I'm supposed to take a probiotic, and everybody's taking probiotic. I just saw a commercial that says I'm supposed to be on a probiotic. Well, guess what? You still need to tell your doctor, as you're told also multiple times, please tell your doctor about everything that you're taking. And for me, I have seen time and time and time again, removing or reducing the probiotic, and reducing the fermented, I call it the fermented madness, because if you're taking the probiotic on top of the kombucha, on top of the kimchi, on top of and it just goes on and on and on, that is a crazy, swirly mess for somebody who deals with bacterial overgrowth. Let me emphasize that. I deal with people coming to me with a problem of too many bacteria in the first place. So my view is, let's not put any more in the picture. Now, with that said, I am all about supporting probiotics with prebiotics, and this new rage about postbiotic. I'm like, okay, it's all in the food, folks. And so that comes back to having a variety of food, having clean food, having organic and detox, everything we've talked about. So in my opinion, we don't need to take external. Now, have I, in unique cases, used not oral probiotics? I'm pretty, I don't want to say anti, but I just observe. However, topical and probiotics, for example, I've used for skin lesions or for face. I've used vaginal inserts for probiotics. So it's not to say I'm against all probiotics, if that makes sense. I'm very much, again, speaking to my expertise. And when I see somebody paying $70 a month, or, it's just like some of these things can go up, up, and up, or they've been spending years juggling and shifting all these probiotics to get this right, perfect imprint on it. I'm like, what are we striving for here? Right. How do you feel? Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate that mindset. I think in general, it's a really good approach to, you don't always have to do every single thing that everyone is talking about or recommending. It's important to look into the research and look into why you're taking this or doing that. And to, like you said, talk to your doctor and let them know what you are thinking of or what you are taking, and see if you even need to. In this case, probiotics might not be the best thing for you. So I appreciate that mindset and that approach to do your due diligence, do your research, and figure out why it is that you are doing certain things or taking certain supplements or something like probiotics. So that's really helpful. Obviously, we've talked about the small intestine quite a bit. What would you say is the difference? Because I think a lot of people might not just understand what the functionality is around small intestine and large intestine. Can you tell us what the difference is between small intestine and large intestine gut health?
Yeah, so a summary would be small intestine is the factory where everything happens, right? All the magic is being made, and large intestine is where all the waste is going. So everything's got to happen in that a length of your small intestine, depending on the length for the person. Some people have extra long, but we're talking 10 to 20 feet in length. That's the factory. That's where everything's going to get manufactured, produced, shifted, changed, absorbed, right? Exchange of all this information. And then we get to the ileocecal valve, where that's the gateway because like I said, if these bacteria are in the large intestine, they're our friend, they're at the right party. But we have this little valve called the ileocecal valve that can backwash some of that trash back into the small intestine, say, for example. You've got your appendix there, right? So there are some things that we've now know has an immunological. Thankfully, I kept mine when somebody wanted to take it out, thinking I was having appendicitis. I was like, nope. Wow. So Yeah, that helps. And we just want to make sure, and there are ways, I love doing visceral manipulation. So some people, yes, you can, if you work with a body worker who checks to maybe see if your ileocecal valve is, quote, open or closed. There are ways that, and again, there's risk factors and histories as to why that might be. An example might be if somebody has abdominal adhesions. There might be something pulling on the structure that then may cause a dysregulation. I kind of jump into like a Star Wars spaceship and be like, hey, these doors aren't opening and closing properly, right? So we might have to do some work there. But otherwise, most people have a good ileocecal valve, and that's going to be ensuring that the waste products are staying and moving through the large intestine, where they will be removed of water, right? So they're going to reduce all of the water and form our feces or stool.
That was a very a thorough explanation, but very simple. I love the way you explain things, and I appreciate this more than anybody, because I do sometimes struggle with very in-depth, like scientific, technical descriptions of anything health related. So I appreciate how you explain in a way that is thorough, but it's also very easily digestible, no pun intended.
Oh, good.
So I appreciate that. I would like to, just on the last couple of questions here, and I understand, much of what we're talking about is, health is individualized, right? It's not going to be the same for one person compared to the next. But when it comes to nutrition, knowing that is very much an individual thing, and you have to learn what is going to work for you and not work for you. What are some foods that you enjoy and do well with when it comes to gut health that you might want to chat a little bit more about?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Because I think there's some confession here that I've gone through different phases of being like really into cooking and I call myself a foodie wannabe, because I really appreciate culinary art, right? Yep. So that's my piece. And what I'll say is that I was reading my colleague Dr. Ben Lynch's book, Dirty Genes, and I was in a really stressful place and not in a very good place, actually, just allowing the sympathetic dominance to happen. And I'm reading these like a quiz, to just kind of see where you are. And yet, meanwhile, I had just ordered some salads, some pre-made salads from this company that, like, when you read the ingredient list, I remember the days when I would be like, oh, I wish I could, but there's such and such in it, because I was on some elimination diet. So of course that one ingredient took it out for me. Yeah. Whereas I just let all that go and say, I'm going to order from this place. And I mean, they just have the most amazing salads and combinations that I would never go and buy the individual ingredients to put together. And to me, it's also extremely affordable for that reason. So I was taking this quiz going, ooh, and the answer was I needed more leafy greens to support my enzyme. And I was like, oh, I know that. I know I'm a mutant at that enzyme. And so, of course, those salads, thankfully, intuitively, I'd already planned that they would show up for me. And within 3 days of me eating these salads, like, oh my gosh, I call it the dimmer switch. My dimmer switch goes up, my function improved like that. And I was just like, oh, wow, right? It was like this very, 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 very clear response to food as medicine. Yeah. So I'm as plant-based as possible is my point. I don't give it any names, and even plant-based is now the new thing, but I just say I'm the highest percentage plant-based that I want to be. I occasionally have animal protein when it calls to me, and it's as clean as I can possibly get access to. Sometimes I want that carnitas street taco too. Sure. Yeah.
I like that you allow yourself some flexibility on some plant protein when it allows or when your body calls for it. But I too do really well on leafy greens and cruciferous vegetables as well. I probably have a little bit more animal protein than some of my other peers, but that's just because I feel good on animal protein, but it's also balance, right? It's making sure that I am getting enough greens and vegetables in diet as well. So
Well,
Awesome.
also, like you mentioned earlier, like as a doctor, I know what works for me, but I have to always think, like, so for example, when you were saying talk to your doctor, you might
Yep.
talk to your doctor and they think you should be on a probiotic because they think
Yeah.
probiotics are the best thing ever, or you should be on a plant-based diet because yada yada, you know, and the studies say, and it's like, but also no, you still can advocate for yourself too, right? And
Yes.
sometimes we gotta shop for the right doctor for a while.
Yes.
You know, I'll have some people be like, I'm like, if I've been treating your SIBO for longer than 3 months, we gotta work on something.
Yeah.
Versus they really like their doctor, but they've been working with them for 2 years. Let's take a look at what else we need to look at.
So, Dr. Melanie, before I get to my last question, where can people learn more about you and find out more about your work?
Well, they can reach me at SIBOsolution.com. That's about small intestine bacterial overgrowth. And then if they want to get more of this overall picture at Intuitive Edge Doctor, that is where I encompass all things SIBO and more in my one-on-one program.
Awesome. I'll have that linked up for people to head on over and learn more about work you're doing. My last question for you, Dr. Melanie, is what does health mean to you?
Oh, health means, in my opinion, it's about loving yourself. That has been a big message that's coming through, because the more you love this physical form we've been given or chosen to be in this time around, is my my thoughts, the more we only know what's best for ourselves, and we have a lot of power. And so to me, health is all about connecting to ourselves and loving ourselves and forgiving ourselves for some of the little bumps and things that we've done along the way, because really, when you look back, they've always brought you to where you're supposed to be. And I hope that this moves somebody when they're hearing it to just be like, wow, I am so intuitive about my body and loving myself. I love that. That would mean a lot to me.
So much of what you said there resonates with me, because as soon as I learned that you have to put yourself first and take care of yourself and love yourself and pay attention to your health, that's when everything kind of clicked for me. It was, okay, if I can actually love who I am and focus on self-care, it just becomes easier to eat healthier, to sleep better, to nourish your relationships. And then everything kind of just comes full circle, and it connects. Everything connects for me now. So I love your answer there. Awesome.
Yay!
Well, Dr. Melanie, thank you so much for your time. It's been really a true joy to speak with you, and I just thank you for your time and expertise.
Thank you for having me.
Awesome. Have a good one.